Every couple of months, I stop throwing in trimming pots and spend a few weeks glazing and firing them. In the case of my work, it's a relatively slow and sometimes monotonous process, yet it's one that can't be rushed. And it's also one that each individual potter has their own little ways of doing it, and that is exactly what this video is about. It begins with the unpacking of my electric kiln, with the pots now hardened as they've been fired to 1000 degrees Celsius. They're also very absorbent and will draw in moisture like a sponge, although despite being stronger at this stage, they are still quite fragile, especially my thinly trimmed pots. So I take an awful lot of care over how I handle the pots at this point and during the glazing process itself, as if I were to grip any one of these pots too tightly with my pair of glazing tongs or even my hand, there's a chance the vessel will crack. Either obviously so, or sometimes it can just be a hairline split that you won't even notice until the pot's been glaze-fired. Once all the pots have been unpacked, all the pots have their bases waxed, together with the undersides of lids and the galleries on jars. This layer acts like a simple resist, preventing the clay body from absorbing water, which means the layer of raw materials that make up the glaze, which is suspended in the water, can't adhere to these areas properly. Which is really important, as if my pots have glaze on their bases, then they'll stick to the kiln shelves during the firing, which in most cases means the pot is ruined. And once all the bisqueware is prepped, glazing can begin. Now, this is a huge topic. There are hundreds of ways of glazing pots, and there are almost endless combinations of surfaces, slips, glazes and textures that are possible to achieve. So really, this will just shed some light on my process. Once my glaze is thoroughly mixed up, as the heavier raw materials do slowly sink to the bottom, I check the thickness with a finger, and I want it to be about the consistency of double cream, so it forms a 2mm layer around the digit that's dipped into it. And for a vast majority of my work, I simply grasp the pot with a pair of tongs, submerge it for a few seconds, in which time the water is absorbed into the porous pot and a layer of the raw materials that make up this particular glaze is left, covering the surface everywhere there isn't wax. And it isn't always just the case of submerging the pot and pulling it out, and instead I need to think about things like the angle the pot goes in, how I remove the pot, and then how I move it thereafter, as the thick layer of glaze on these doesn't solidify instantly, and in some cases I need to keep waving the pot around in midair so that the quickly drying glaze settles into a nice even surface. With that being said, that doesn't always happen, and more often than not, there are a few stray drips that cover the surface, and with any pot that was dipped using the pair of tongs, there are the marks left by the 4 metal spikes that make contact. Bowls are easy enough, as long as they aren't too large. Yet with a pot like these bud vases, which have an enclosed interior, I have to let the glaze bubble in, and then I swirl it around the top and bottom to make sure the interior walls are coated, then dip it once again and quickly flip it. That way a nice smooth surface is achieved on the inward sloping rim. With other shapes, which might be difficult to do with tongs, I sometimes dip the outside first, and then the following day, once the glaze on the outside is dried, I'll pour more inside, swirl it around, and then pour it out. When you're using a pair of tongs and you draw the pot out from the glaze, there comes a point where you need to tip the glaze that's inside out, and that can occasionally leave you with a slightly messy outer surface as the glaze runs over it again. So in some cases, even with relatively simple pots that could be done with tongs, I prefer to do it this way around, as it leaves me with neater surfaces. Although again, it's worth mentioning that with other glazes that have different recipes, simply dipping them with tongs might work. And there are other recipes that even if you clean the tong marks up so carefully, you'll never really be able to get rid of them, which means you need to find a glazing method that works for you, your pots, and your glazes. I typically use 3 different crackle glazes that are mostly made up from feldspar and nepheline cyanide. They're always mixed really thoroughly before I begin using them, and then, if I am using my arm, I scrape as much of the excess glaze back into the bucket as I can, as all the raw materials I use to mix my glazes in-house aren't necessarily the cheapest things. And so, as I'm glazing, I really try and minimise the amount of glaze I waste. And so, after each glazing session, and after I'm done with a specific glaze, instead of just washing the tools in the sink, I wash them in a bowl, like so, one of which I have for each individual glaze I use. This way I can accumulate all that extra glaze for later use. Another really simple tip for minimising mess is to always place the tools you're using to glaze with on the lid of the bucket. as opposed to on the tabletop, for instance, which can really easily just be added back into the larger buckets of glaze. Glazing the pots is just the first step in the process, and once dipped, I'll let all of the pots sit out overnight so the sodden clay and the glazed surface have some time to dry out, and this makes the following step so much easier. For my particular glazes, anyway, as their surfaces turn from being very tacky and stiff to powdery and light, which makes things like these tongue marks or stray drips like this far simpler to clean up. And whilst the bottoms of the pots were waxed, that doesn't stop small droplets of glaze from adhering to it, or in some cases completely coating it. And so, the next step of this process is to very carefully clean up each individual pot, and by doing so, I end up with far neater and more professional looking pieces. And so much of that is achieved at this cleanup stage, as I work so hard to make the line where clay and glaze meet as clean and crisp as it can be. And so there are no specks of glaze left on the base. But before we begin that process, I just want to reiterate how individual each glaze can really be, as there truly are millions of different glazes you can use. Some work in electric kilns, others in gas firings, some prefer being wood-fired or salt-fired, and each will have its own characteristics in terms of how it's applied to the pots and thereafter how it's cleaned up and fired. And I just really want to make that clear, as what works for me and the way I finish my pots, such as all the ways of doing it in this video, may very well not work for you. Trial and error is an absolute must, especially when you're mixing up your own glazes from all kinds of different raw materials. And beyond that, the glaze you're using and its characteristics can greatly affect the shape and style of the clay work of your actual pot. In most cases, you want to find a glaze that's relatively stable, like this white crackle glaze, which, as you can see, barely moves past the line I initially applied it. This next one has begun to drip, especially where it's a bit more thick, and whilst it looks quite nice, would ultimately mean you need to be more careful when you're glazing your pots, or you'd need to finish them with a groove or a glaze catch to prevent it spilling over onto the kiln shelf. And then there are glazes like this yellow, which flow off the tile, making it highly impractical, or a glaze that should only be used on the interior surface of a pot. That way it can just pool into itself. Thankfully, the glazes I use are all really quite stable unless they're over-fired or I glaze them far too thickly. This does mean though that I can glaze my pots really close down to the foot without having to worry about it spilling over onto the kiln shelf. Occasionally, when I glaze the outside and then the inside, I'm left with a sort of messy rim like this, and so to tidy up these stray drips, I very carefully slice the worst of them away bit by bit, as I don't want them to chip off and bring more glaze off with it. And ultimately my goal is to make a surface around the pot that's as even and flush as possible, without any notably thick spots or thin spots, as glaze thickness has another huge determining factor on how your glazes end up looking. With this glaze, as long as a thick patch doesn't encompass the rim, it can be quite difficult to notice them, whereas where it's too thin, the glaze almost loses all of its quality and fires a sort of dull brown tone, whereas this glaze should fire to a pale green tone. All of this means that getting the thickness right is almost the most important thing when it comes to glazing my pots. As this particular glaze recipe doesn't contain much clay, when it does dry, it becomes quite powdery, like so, and I can just use my fingertips to fettle down those thick spots, such as the tongue marks, and equally, if there are any small holes in the surface of the glaze, the excess powder that's removed as I rub over the surface fills them up perfectly. And once again, I scrape the excess dust into this glaze-specific basin of water. I trim my flat base pots to have a beveled edge around the outside. This means there's a sharp angle where the body meets foot, and it makes sponging off excess glaze away from the foot relatively easy as there's a clear line to sponge to. For this process, I'm using a sponge that's really soaked in water, and it's folded to a specific shape to match the area of the pot I'm cleaning up. As I work, I regularly thoroughly wash the sponge out in the basin of water below, as the sponge really quickly becomes clogged with glaze, which makes it harder to remove the glaze with. You don't want to push the glaze around on the vessel, rather you want the soak sponge to be removing it. It's slow, steady work, but the neater it is at this point, the better it'll look once fired. Although, there are things that can happen during the firing that will catch you out, no matter how careful you've been, and that's really just the nature of the craft. And when the pots are finished, I place them down onto a surface that's been wiped clean, so no glaze dust, left over from previous pots, or the same vessel, sticks back onto the freshly cleaned piece. In most cases when I'm cleaning pots, I move them from the wearboard they were placed on directly after being glazed onto a freshly cleaned one. Thereafter, I can scrape up all the leftover glaze dust and deposit it back into its respective basin of water in an attempt to save as much of it as I can. And it's at this point I give my wearboards a really thorough clean by using a really soaked sponge, and I make sure to scrub each side, and I even do the wearboard's edges and ends. And then I leave them standing up to dry out standing upwards, which prevents the boards from warping too much. Bowls are an altogether more difficult form to tidy up. The interior section is relatively easy, as in most cases there's just a few tongue marks that need wiping over. It's the foot though, which is more difficult, as accurately cleaning up the glaze line both on the outside of the foot and the inside can be relatively fiddly. Beyond just sponging the foot clean is how you hold the pot throughout this process, which can be quite tiresome for one's hand, as it needs to grip the pot in such a way that your fingers don't move and rub over the surface, as it can potentially damage the glaze. For the most part, I just use my fingertips or my thumb to scour away the two protruding lumps left over from where the tongs grasp the bowl. I then flip the bowl over and begin cleaning up the underside. And I'm quite lucky with my glaze, as even if there are slight bumps or irregularities left, as long as they aren't near where the glaze meets the clay, they really melt and flatten into the rest of the surface, and I'm just left with a spot where the glaze is slightly more intense in colour, and the crackled nature of the glaze tends to be more interesting. And because of that, when I glaze these bowls, I do so in such a way that I purposefully let the glaze pool on the inside form, but it can't be too thick, as otherwise it can actually cause the stoneware to crack. I then use my thumb to clean over the inside of the foot, and then the trickier part begins. I use a soaked sponge, but one that's not too wet, as I don't want the excess water to drip and leak over the glazed surface, and I carefully fettle all the way around, working to make the glaze line as crisp as I can. The fingers of my left hand pinching really tightly, and when I change position I do so just by rotating it via the foot. What's helpful is that in my clay work beneath the glaze, I've trimmed the foot so there's a very sharp edge that protrudes in the middle. This means I can sponge the glaze away quite vigorously to this sharp line, and it sort of acts like a guide for my movements. On the other hand, if the foot ring, instead of being angled like so, was just completely flat from where it connects to the bowl to the base of the foot, I'd have no guide to work with as I sponge, and it would be more difficult to create consistent, clean lines. Cleaning the outside of the foot is easy though, compared to doing the inside, but once again, it really helps that I'm sponging to a sharp line in the clay work that I turned, and this means I can just follow the same angle all the way around, and as long as I don't extend past that, it should remain nice and consistent. After glazing and tidying up several thousands of pots over the years, I have certain ways of folding my sponge so it best fits different areas of the pots I'm working on. Otherwise it's nothing special, as it's just a small scrap I cut from a much larger car sponge, as they do wear out with time, especially when used for 8 hours a day and rubbed against a slightly coarse clay body. And here's the much cleaner, finished foot, and it's a good side-by-side comparison to show just how much these pots will shrink when they're glaze fired to 1300 degrees Celsius. In comparison, mugs are much quicker to tidy up, but as you can see, there's always a few specks of glaze that settle on the wax, and blots this size definitely need to be removed, as it would only take one of these to stick the pot to the kiln shelf, leaving a permanent, unwanted mark on the pot. And once again, this is the before and after. In most cases, once the pot is pulled out of the glaze with the glaze on the metal tongs themselves simply fills the holes, and in other cases they can leave a small crater revealing the clay body underneath. When that happens, I simply use a small brush which I dip into the glaze and then dab into the hole, and then I can simply rub over the tongue marks both inside and out to smooth the area flush. But, like I've mentioned before, this is always something I do the day after, once the glaze has been given some time to dry out a bit. If I glaze a pot badly, and there are some notable streaks or errors in the surface, I'll never try to immediately fix it, unless it's really terrible. Instead, I usually wait until the following day to do any corrections, as trying to tidy up a glazed surface that's quite wet and tacky can be more difficult to tidy up compared to when it's dry like this. If I do see any notable pinholes in the surface, I'll brush them over, but I don't bother with the tiny ones, as they just melt into the surface of the glaze later on. It's also worth noting that the wax that's coated onto the bottoms of these simply burns away during the glaze firing, leaving absolutely no trace. And the bubbles you can see on the surface at this stage simply occurred as I let these cups dry over the radiator, but they'll have no effect on the final appearance of the mug. And once again I can use the beveled edge that surrounds the bottoms of these mugs like a guide, as a point I know not to sponge any further. The last part I check is my maker's mark, and if I do notice any small specks of glaze stuck within it, I'll gouge it out with the tip of a knife. And that's one mug down and only 79 left to go. Always working over a basin of water to catch the excess dust, and although I'm not wearing one now, if I'm doing this for a prolonged period of time, I will wear a mask. Despite it being uncomfortable, being it strapped onto my face for the whole day, it beats breathing in the fine dust. I also have two different sets of sponges, the one on the right, which I only use for white glazes and porcelain, and the one on the left, which I only ever use for glazes that contain red iron oxide. And this just helps stop contamination, as this white glaze is so easily stained, and even if a tiny bit of iron gets onto it, in the form of a drop of water, there's a high chance you'll see it after it's been fired. One interesting thing though is that when the glaze contains more red iron oxide, the glazes tend to have a neater surface when they're pulled from the bucket, and not nearly so much sticks onto the wax below, and this ultimately means the white range of work does take longer to tidy up compared to the iron-based recipes. Once I've finished using a specific glaze and all the pots have been tidied up, I'll let all the glaze powder settle and then pour away much of the excess water, and then I'll use a sieve, like this, to add it back into my much larger buckets of glaze, and it does save a surprising amount over the year. As I glaze, I also keep my work surfaces really clean, that way I can scrape off and save any excess like this, but it's always added to the basin first, which I'll then sieve into the main bucket, just so no small bits of wood or tiny bits of stone or ceramic find their way into my glaze buckets. Lastly, in some cases, I even use the wheel to sponge away the excess glaze. Usually this is for doing the rims of lidded jars. I begin by carefully centering the pots, and then I use a soaked sponge and press it against the rim, holding it firmly in place. But as soon as it feels saturated, I'll change the position. That way a new piece of sponge is fettling away the glaze. Otherwise the sponge will clog up, dry out, stick to the pot, and then draw it off center. And with all the pots tidied up, I'll now spend the following weeks packing and firing my Rhoda KG340 gas kiln. This changes the pots from these pastel pink, red and white tones into these much glassier green, white and grey hues, which have all now shrunk a tiny bit, and they're set in stone forever. Thanks so much for watching. Like always, the next couple of weeks are going to be really hectic on my end. Be it glazing pots and firing them and preparing for my last online shop update of the year, together with working on my secret, ongoing project, means that the next few videos may be more simple in nature. Anyway, that's all for now, and I'll see you next week.